In the scorching hell of Stalingrad, in August 1942, a colossal concrete and steel fortress loomed over the burning city. The grain elevator, a 35-meter titan of Soviet industry, was about to become a meat grinder. As Hitler's Sixth Army stormed towards the Volga, 50 men, a motley crew of exhausted soldiers, sailors, and NKVD troops, barricaded themselves inside this behemoth. Against these desperate defenders, the Wehrmacht hurled an entire division. Waves of German infantry crashed against the elevator's walls. Bullets thudded into concrete. Flames licked at steel, and the screams of the dying echoed through halls choked with smoke and burning grain. The Germans brought everything: tanks, flamethrowers, and 88mm anti-aircraft guns firing point blank. In a single day, 105mm howitzers pumped 500 rounds into the structure, punching 44 2-foot-wide holes through solid concrete. Yet still the Soviets held. Inside, hell reigned. Water ran out. Machine guns overheated. Men fought with cracked lips and bleeding hands, their lungs burning from smoke and pulverized concrete. They dropped their fallen comrades into grain silos, literally becoming part of the fortress they gave their lives defending. Lieutenant Andrei Kazanov, one of the few survivors, later recalled the nightmarish reality within the grain elevator's walls. Quote, "We sensed and heard the enemy soldiers' breath and footsteps, but we could not see them in the smoke. We fired at sounds. For 6 days, this handful of men held back the tide of Operation Case Blue. They bought time with their lives, each hour of resistance paid for in blood. But as ammunition dwindled, the Germans tightened their noose. When all Soviet forces around the grain elevator finally retreated in defeat, the few men still alive inside the building decided to make a legendary last stand. While they drew breath, they would make the German Sixth Army pay." The road to Stalingrad began on June 22, 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the world's largest military offensive. The German Wehrmacht, along with its Axis allies, poured across the Soviet border with over 3 million men. Despite initial successes that saw German forces advance hundreds of kilometers and encircle millions of Soviet troops, the operation failed to achieve its primary objective, the capture of Moscow. As winter set in, the Soviet counteroffensive pushed the Germans back from the capital's outskirts. Hitler, refusing to accept defeat, regrouped his forces for a new offensive in 1942. This time, the target was the south, the oil-rich Caucasus region, and the industrial center of Stalingrad. The summer of 1942 saw the launch of Case Blue, the German offensive aimed at seizing the Soviet oil fields. Initially, the operation met with success. German and Romanian armies advanced rapidly, capturing Rostov and pushing towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus. By August, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. Named after Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, the city stretched 40 kilometers along the western bank of the Volga River. Its capture would sever a crucial Soviet supply route and secure the German army's northern flank for the push into the oil fields. Hitler, obsessed with the symbolic value of the city bearing his rival's name, diverted forces from the Caucasus to reinforce the Stalingrad offensive. The Soviets, recognizing the city's strategic importance, rushed reinforcements to Stalingrad. General Georgy Zhukov was dispatched to organize the defense, and the 62nd Army under General Vasily Chuikov was tasked with holding the city at all costs. As German forces entered the outskirts, they encountered fanatical resistance. Every street, factory, and building became a battleground. In this urban nightmare of broken concrete and twisted metal, one structure stood out: the grain elevator. Located in the southern part of the city, less than a kilometer from the Volga, this massive concrete silo rose 35 meters high. Built in the 1930s to store the region's wheat harvests, its thick walls were designed to withstand grain dust explosions. Now, these same walls would shield Soviet forces from German artillery and bombs. The grain elevator's strategic value was immense. Its height provided unparalleled observation over the southern approaches to the city. From its upper floors, Soviet spotters could direct artillery fire against German positions and movements. Its central location made it a linchpin in the Soviet defensive line, anchoring their positions along the river. For the Germans, capturing the grain elevator became essential to securing the southern sector of Stalingrad. Its fall would open the way to the central ferry landing, cutting off supplies and reinforcements to the Soviet defenders. Yet the building's design made it a formidable fortress. Multiple floors, thick concrete walls and numerous firing positions allowed a relatively small force to hold off much larger attacking units. As September wore on, the battle for Stalingrad intensified. The city became a meat grinder, chewing up men and machines at a terrifying rate. In the south, the grain elevator symbolized Soviet resistance, a concrete sentinel overlooking a battlefield of shattered lives. As the battle for Stalingrad's southern sector reached its crescendo, the city had become a hellscape of shattered buildings and corpse-strewn streets. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning flesh. Amidst this apocalyptic tableau, two commanders prepared to clash in a struggle that would determine the fate of the city. Major General Arno von Lenski, newly appointed leader of the 24th Panzer Division, surveyed the devastation from his command post. His eyes were sunken from lack of sleep, his uniform caked with dust and grime. The division he inherited was a shadow of its former self. Barely 7,000 men and a paltry 23 tanks remained from its original strength. Yet Hitler's orders were clear: push to the Volga, whatever the cost. Across the battlefield, Colonel Vasily P. Dubyansky of the Soviet 35th Guards Rifle Division steeled himself for the coming onslaught. His men were exhausted, many having fought for days without rest, but retreat was not an option. Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov's orders echoed in his ears, quote, "Not a step back." Dubyansky knew that every meter of ground would be paid for in blood. The German offensive had begun on September 13th with a thunderous bombardment that turned much of Stalingrad into a wasteland. Buildings collapsed like houses of cards, burying defenders and civilians alike. The following day, Kampfgruppe Edelsheim of the 24th Panzer Division surged forward, their tanks crushing the rubble under their treads as they raced towards the Volga. In their haste, they committed a fatal error. The grain elevator, a behemoth of concrete rising 35 meters above the ruins, was left in Soviet hands. Senior Lieutenant Andrei Kozyanov and his 18 men from the 10th NKVD Rifle Division seized the opportunity, turning the elevator into a fortress. The German High Command, realizing their mistake, ordered the 94th Infantry Division to rectify the situation. On September 16th, the 267th Infantry Regiment engaged in a brutal firefight with the Soviet 133rd Tank Brigade near the elevator. The sound of small arms fire was punctuated by the earth-shaking booms of tank guns and the screams of the wounded. As night fell, Dubyansky scrambled to reorganize his battered forces. The 131st Rifle Division, 10th Rifle Brigade and 271st NKVD Regiment, once proud units, were now reduced to a hodgepodge of survivors. Hope came in the form of the 92nd Naval Rifle Brigade, fresh reinforcements ferried across the Volga under the cover of darkness. The crossing was a harrowing affair. Soviet sailors, many of whom had never seen combat on land, huddled in small boats as German artillery illuminated the night sky and churned the river into a maelstrom of explosions. Those who made it to the western bank were immediately thrust into the inferno. Dawn on September 17th broke to the sounds of German preparations. The men of the 267th Regiment checked their weapons, many hands shaking from a combination of exhaustion and fear. They knew what awaited them. The grain elevator had become a symbol of Soviet resistance, its defenders fighting with desperation. Inside the elevator, Kozyanov and his men, now reinforced by a platoon from the Naval Brigade, prepared for the inevitable assault. They had little food or water, and ammunition was running low. But they had courage in abundance and a clear understanding of their mission's importance. If the elevator fell, the southern sector would crumble. As the German infantry began their approach, Soviet artillery opened up from concealed positions. The battlefield erupted in a cacophony of explosions, the air filled with screaming shells and flying debris. German soldiers advanced through a hail of fire, stepping over their fallen countrymen, their faces masks of grim determination. The grain elevator loomed before them, its concrete walls pockmarked by previous attacks, but still standing defiantly. From its upper floors, Soviet defenders rained down a hail of bullets and grenades. Every window, every crevice seemed to spit gunfire. Inside the massive concrete structure, only 50 exhausted soldiers of the 35th Guards Rifle Division remained, their numbers bolstered by a platoon of naval infantrymen from the 92nd Naval Rifle Brigade. The arrival of these sailors, clad in their naval uniforms and armed with antiquated Maxim machine guns and early model Russian anti-tank rifles, initially drew mockery from the beleaguered guardsmen. However, their derision would soon turn to admiration as the sailors proved their mettle in the crucible of combat. As dawn broke on September 18th, the full might of the German war machine was brought to bear on the grain elevator. The 94th Infantry Division, comprised of the 267th, 274th, and 276th Regiments, surrounded the structure. The 274th Regiment, tasked with taking the elevator, prepared for what they hoped would be the final assault. At 1:15 p.m., the Germans unleashed a hellish barrage. The 24th Panzer Division's 88 mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire, their high-velocity rounds punching 44 2-foot wide holes in the elevator's concrete walls. The sound was deafening, concrete chips and dust filling the air as the defenders huddled inside. When this proved insufficient, the Germans switched tactics. Flamethrower units advanced, spewing liquid fire at the base of the structure. The heat was intense, and the acrid smell of burning grain added to the already choking atmosphere inside the elevator. Yet still, the defenders held on. In a final attempt to break the Soviet resistance, a battery of 105 mm guns from the 24th Panzer Division's 89th Artillery Regiment was brought to bear. Their direct fire caused a section of the lower floors to collapse, but incredibly, the Soviet defenders refused to yield. Inside the inferno, conditions were apocalyptic. Lieutenant Andrei Kazanov, a naval infantryman who survived the battle, later recounted, quote, "Enemy tanks and infantry, approximately 10 times our numbers, soon launched an attack from south and west. After the first attack was beaten back, a second began, then a third. In all, 10 attacks were beaten off on September 18th. In the elevator, the grain was on fire, the water in the machine guns evaporated, the wounded were thirsty, but there was no water nearby. That was how we defended ourselves, 24 hours a day for 3 days. Heat, smoke, thirst, all our lips were cracked." As the sun set on September 18th, the German 274th Infantry Regiment had made no progress. The grain elevator remained in Soviet hands. The following day brought no respite. The frustrated Germans intensified their efforts. The air was filled with the constant crack of small arms fire, the thump of grenades, and the earth-shaking explosions of artillery shells. By September 20th, the situation for the Soviet defenders had become dire. The 35th Guards Rifle Division, under increasing pressure from the German 274th Infantry and the 29th Motorized Division, was driven back to positions east of the grain elevator. General Chuikov, realizing the precariousness of their position, ordered a general withdrawal. However, the defenders of the grain elevator refused to abandon their posts. As their comrades retreated, they remained, determined to hold out to the last man. The Germans, sensing victory, tightened their noose around the structure. For 2 more days, the Germans pounded the elevator with everything they had. Dive bombers screamed overhead, dropping their payloads with pinpoint accuracy. Artillery and mortars rained down a constant barrage. Large chunks of concrete rained down, and fires raged unchecked inside the structure. On September 22nd, in a final, desperate gambit, the German commander ordered 16 tanks forward, accompanied by assault troops. The Soviet defenders, their numbers now whittled down to a mere handful, fought with the fury of cornered animals. Anti-tank rifles barked, their rounds occasionally finding their mark and disabling a German panzer. Molotov cocktails arced through the air, bursting into flames as they struck their targets. Kazanov remembers, quote, "Explosions were shattering the concrete, the grain was in flames, we could not see each other for dust and smoke, but we cheered each other with shouts. Fighting flared up inside the building." In an incredible display of heroism and determination, the Soviets managed to repel 7 separate German attacks. But it was a losing battle. Ammunition was critically low, Food and water had run out days ago, and the defenders were on the verge of physical collapse. As night fell on September 22nd, the Germans launched a surprise attack. Using intelligence gathered from their failed assaults, they targeted a 2-meter-wide trench encircling the base of the elevator. Under the cover of darkness, German troops sprinted across open ground, braving Soviet machine gun fire to reach the trench. By 8 p.m., the Germans had gained a foothold in the southwestern section of the grain elevator. Room by room, floor by floor, they fought their way through the labyrinth of steel and concrete. The remaining Soviet defenders, realizing the end was near, attempted one final breakout to the south. Most were cut down or captured by the waiting troops of the 29th Motorized Division. At 2:20 a.m. on September 23rd, after nearly a week of continuous combat, the grain elevator finally fell into German hands. As dawn broke, a corporal of the 274th Infantry climbed to the top floor and raised the Nazi flag. The swastika, now fluttering atop the battered structure, was visible for miles around, a symbol of the costly German victory and the indomitable spirit of the Soviet defenders, who had held out against impossible odds. The battle for the grain elevator had lasted far longer than anyone could have anticipated. It had cost the Germans dearly in men and materials, and had bought precious time for the Soviet defenders of Stalingrad. Though the elevator had fallen, its defenders had written a heroic chapter of the Great Patriotic War, one that would be remembered long after the guns fell silent. This grueling battle for a single building would prove to be a microcosm of the larger struggle for Stalingrad, foreshadowing the brutal urban combat that would characterize the remainder of the campaign. The human cost of the battle was staggering. While exact casualty figures for the grain elevator fight are difficult to determine, the broader context is telling. During its 11 days of urban fighting in Stalingrad, the Soviet 35th Guards Rifle Division suffered a devastating 9,000 casualties. The German 94th Infantry Division and supporting units also incurred heavy losses, with some companies reduced to less than half their original strength. The legacy of the grain elevator's defenders quickly grew to legendary proportions within the Red Army. Their stubborn resistance against overwhelming odds became a symbol of Soviet determination and sacrifice. The story of a handful of men holding off an entire German division for days inspired other defenders of Stalingrad, reinforcing Stalin's not-a-step-back order and steeling the resolve of Soviet soldiers throughout the city. More critically, the prolonged fight for the grain elevator and other strong points in southern Stalingrad bought precious time for the Soviet High Command. This time was used to reinforce the city's defenders and, more importantly, to begin planning and preparations for Operation Uranus, the massive counteroffensive that would ultimately turn the tide of the battle and the war. The grain elevator battle highlighted the challenges of urban warfare for the German army. It exposed the limitations of their blitzkrieg tactics in a city environment and forced them to expend disproportionate resources on individual strongpoints. This pattern would repeat itself throughout Stalingrad, gradually wearing down the German Sixth Army and its supporting units. By tying down significant German forces in southern Stalingrad, the defenders of the grain elevator and other nearby positions prevented these units from being used in the assault on the city center and the crucial northern factory district. This distribution of German forces would prove critical in the months to come, as it left their flanks weakly defended by less experienced Romanian and Italian troops. On November 19, 1942, less than 2 months after the fall of the grain elevator, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. This massive pincer movement targeted the weaker Axis forces, protecting the German Sixth Army's flanks. The operation was a resounding success, encircling the German forces in Stalingrad and trapping some 265,000 Axis personnel. The siege of the German Sixth Army would last until February 2, 1943, when the last pocket of resistance in Stalingrad surrendered. This marked a decisive turning point on the Eastern Front, shattering the myth of German invincibility and beginning the long Soviet advance that would eventually reach Berlin. In many ways, the battle for the grain elevator encapsulated the larger struggle for Stalingrad. It demonstrated the fierce Soviet resistance that would characterize the entire campaign, the challenges of urban warfare for the German forces, and the gradual erosion of German military strength that would ultimately lead to their defeat. The defenders of the grain elevator, through their sacrifice, contributed to a chain of events that would alter the course of World War II. By forcing the Germans to expend valuable time and resources, they played a part in setting the stage for the successful Soviet counteroffensive. This, in turn, marked the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime, as it lost the initiative on the Eastern Front and began a long, costly retreat back to Germany.